as well. So I'm now recording. And so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. This is a session to discuss vaccine information. It's neither intended to be pro or con. It's intended to be informative and to create dialogue and conversation with the community so that people can make informed decisions as we move forward in the next phases of getting vaccines in our community. So my name is Mike Affelberg. I'm the president of United Way. I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and then I'm going to turn it over to our host, Wendy Hunt. So the agenda for today is we're going to start with Jay Minkara. Jay is the executive director of the Nashua Regional Planning Commission. Jay's worked in planning, economic development, and transportation in New England for over 30 years. Prior to coming to the Nashua Regional Planning Commission in 2017, he served as president and CEO of Develop Springfield, a nonprofit development corporation, Springfield, Mass, as economic development director for the cities of Manchester and Nashua, New Hampshire, and community development director for the town of Merrimack, New Hampshire. I think you can sense a theme here. Jay has a Bachelor of Urban Planning from the University of Cincinnati and a JD from the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. He's an inactive member of the New Hampshire Bar Association, serves on my board of directors at the United Way of Greater Nashua, and is an alternate on the Nashua Zoning Board of Adjustment. Our second speaker, and so Jay's going to think about this as a little bit of like an inverted pyramid. Jay's going to take a very broad perspective on our community, and then we're going to drill down a little bit into a micro level view of business, and that is going to be Tom Sapienza. Tom is the director of operations at Hampshire Hills Athletic Club and general manager of the Hampshire Dome out in Milford, New Hampshire. Tom has a CPA and a BS cum laude in accounting and an MBA from the University of Connecticut, and has been involved with entrepreneurial business since 1980 when he joined the Entrepreneurial Services Group of Arthur Young and Company. Tom served as controller and CFO of 2 computer software startup companies. His experience includes public offerings, SEC reporting, business planning, and high growth and turnaround situations. Since joining Hampshire Hills as part of the consulting engagement in early 1992, Tom's responsibilities now include finance and accounting, human resources and administration, budgeting and business development, facility and risk management, and has worked closely with each of the directors to assist them in managing their departments. He was a consultant and or board member of several Southern New Hampshire small businesses and served on the board of directors of the Souhegan Valley Chamber of Commerce. Tom is also a former chairperson of the Finance Committee for St. Christopher's School in Nashua and former chairperson of the Town of Milford Economic Development Advisory Council. Tom is also certified as a spinning cycling instructor. So if we run out of things to talk about,
that's the most important part.
Everybody can whip out their Peloton and Tom will take us to task. And he currently volunteers as an accountant and advisor to the New Hampshire Wellpoint Foundation. And our final speaker today, drilling down a little bit, is on the medical side. And that's my friend, Dr. Stephanie Wolf Rosenblum, who brings more than 30 years of service leadership and a wide range of experiences to her healthcare work. After completing her medical degree at Yale University and a pulmonary and critical care fellowship at Yale New Haven Hospital, Dr. Stephanie Wolf Rosenblum entered full-time clinical practice. During this period, she served in multiple leadership roles, including as the medical director of the intensive care unit and as chief of medicine at Southern New Hampshire Medical Center. Dr. Wolf Rosenblum then played a critical role in developing a physician-driven leadership organization as medical director of the multi-specialty group Foundation Medical Partners. Subsequently, Dr. Wolf Rosenblum served as the elected chief of staff and appointed chief medical officer of the hospital, where her work focused on clinical excellence, a culture of safety, and the patient experience. Dr. Wolf Rosenblum has also shared her expertise locally and statewide, including as a member of the Mayor's Opioid Task Force, the New Hampshire Drug Fatality Review Committee, and as chair of the Foundation for Healthy Communities and the New Hampshire Quality Assurance Commission. Dr. Wolf Rosenblum holds an undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Brown University, a master's in medical management from the Heinz School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Wolf Rosenblum and her husband Michael reside in Nashua. They have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. So thank you to each of our panelists today. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Wendy Hunt, my friend, and the president and CEO of the Greater Nashua Chamber of Commerce. Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I wanted to quickly thank our sponsor, Bank of America, who sponsors all the Chamber educational series. A little background of how we decided to do this when Mike and I were talking about the economy. I was with the Greater Merrimack-Sauhegan Valley Chamber prior to taking this position about 6 weeks ago, and much of last year was spent on helping businesses recover and pivot and educating them about resources. And the entire time that we were talking to them, our businesses seemed to be saying, we can't wait till a vaccine is available because things will get back to normal. So as the months and months have progressed with vaccinations becoming available, we were noticing there were more appointments than people now signing up for them. So there was some concern that vaccine hesitancy may have been caused by people not understanding the science behind it. So that's where Dr. Wolf Rosenblum comes in. But also we wanted to talk to Jay, who runs the Regional Planning Commission, and to Tom, who, you know, we know all his job descriptions at Hampshire Hills, but what was unique about Hampshire Hills is there's so many businesses under one roof. They're a restaurant, they're an event center, they're a gym, they're a preschool, they're a hair salon, among other types of businesses. So we thought it would be interesting to talk to him as a panelist. So that's how we got to where we are. So I am going to start with Jay, Executive Director of the National Regional Planning Commission, for the broader spectrum of economics in the vaccine. And Jay, if you could start with explaining what different towns that NRPC cover, that would probably be great.
And before you do that, Jay, just for everybody's information, I'm going to mute everybody. You have the ability to unmute yourself throughout the meeting. Our speakers, you know, don't start talking because you're going to be muted, but just to eliminate background noise from everybody's presentation.
So I just took the assertive step of unmuting myself. Brief overview. The National Regional Planning Commission is obviously a regional planning commission. We are a political subdivision of the state, so we're created by state law. We've got 13 communities in our region centered around the city of Nashua, going from the towns kind of in the Monadnock foothills like Lyonborough, Wilton, Mason, all the way east to Pelham. So pretty good sized region, pretty diverse economically. And in terms of our functional areas, we focus a great deal on transportation planning, land use planning, as well as environmental planning, and a whole bunch of other things in between, as well as economic development, which is how I know Wendy from working with the chamber. So if you'd like, I'd just kind of jump into an overview, or Wendy, I'm not sure if you had a follow-up question.
Yep, go on and do your thing, Jay.
So I mean, the subject is vaccines and the impacts of vaccination, and of course there are far more knowledgeable people on this Zoom call than I am to address it. Certainly from the medical side, I can talk about what I perceive in terms of impacts. Going back to what we do. We're planners. We work in planning, and at the core of planning is people. That's what we're doing all of this for. And we do that primarily in focusing on the physical realm. So planning for quality environments for people to live in, to work in, to gather, and how they can connect with each other through things like transportation, as well as through different forums. Obviously, every aspect of what we do, like everyone, has been dramatically impacted by the pandemic. I've been doing this kind of thing long enough to have gone through some significant economic cycles, the impacts of the Great Recession, impacts of prior recessions, different social changes of significance. And for the most part, while some of those have been dramatically impactful, I've never seen something happen so dramatically and so quickly that affects almost every aspect of everyone's life. I mean, it truly is amazing. And as I think about getting back to normal, I think we can all appreciate that the impacts have been so deep and so significant and far-reaching. And we have certainly not seen the extent of those impacts, that it's really not, from my perspective, about getting back to normal. It's about getting back to at least an optimal level of functionality, getting our systems functioning in a way that meets the needs of our citizens. And that could change. It could be a different way than it was a year ago, a year and a half ago. So kind of, I look at it maybe inappropriately in different buckets. And the first area that, for me comes to mind is the impacts to public discourse. And what I mean by that is primarily the function of local government, which has been significantly impacted. We've all done our best to pivot to Zoom, to do whatever we can to try to accommodate the public, but it really is not and cannot be the same as having interpersonal, meetings with people, seeing people. As I mentioned, we staff planning boards, we staff zoning boards. I sit on a zoning board. There's no way that it's the same to be encountering people on a screen like this versus somebody standing there right in front of you in the same room. It's just not the same. The ability to access public records, the ability to be able to readily go and get whatever it is, whether it's a driver's license or birth certificate. We do need to be able to get back to a point where we can do these things functionally, and also where we can do them in many cases in the confidence that your confidentiality is being protected, which is much more challenging when you're doing that online. It's certainly possible, but it is much more challenging. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about the economic impacts, and those are really significant. I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder, but they're, in addition to the obvious impact on our restaurants, our hospitality industry, there is the impact of what I look at, kind of across the board. Again, we're all trying to pivot, but there is this lack of the power, what I think is so powerful. So much of what we've tried to foster through entrepreneurship is, those unintentional encounters, those unintentional exchanges of ideas that happen because people see each other and interact with each other face to face. It's not planned. I didn't set up a Zoom meeting. It's that I happened to see Wendy walking down the street on the way to the office, and we had a brief exchange. And maybe an idea popped into my mind 5 minutes later or 10 minutes later. So those are the kinds of things are lacking. I won't dive into much more into that, but just to say that I think the impact on hospitality is probably the most obvious that we've seen, but there have been really significant impacts to manufacturing, and that tends to be less to the front of our minds. But I think we all experience it when we see the disruption to the supply chain that's obviously affected every one of us going to the grocery store. The impacts of it are far more reaching than I think most of us appreciate. A factory floor involves generally a lot of people working in fairly close proximity. And that's a very challenging environment to manage when you have a pandemic going on. Obviously, the higher the rates of vaccination, well, I should say, obviously, what I at least understand and believe from the medical experts that I'm hearing and our public, our partners in public health, is that our opportunity to get those factory floors full, to get people back into the restaurants, to get people seeing each other, or I should say patronizing businesses that require people to be there in person, is dependent on getting a higher rate of our population vaccinated, if not everyone. And I know I'm hogging the floor, but the other impact that really jumps out at me is what I would call that social cultural impact. And that's really, really important for people's obviously ability to connect with each other, but in so many different ways. For people's social and emotional health, we have a need to see each other, to be together again. Young children do have a need to be able to do things like, going to story hour at the library and encountering other children, being able to go to a playground. I mean, those are really profound when you think about the impact of young children who are not able to encounter other children. That's enormous. And they're at a very, very formative stage of development. So the social emotional concern for me is huge. And at the other end of the spectrum, our senior citizens, particularly those who are living in assisted living facilities and nursing homes, that loss of contact is tremendous. And the impact on not just them, but families. There is absolutely critical that we can open it. And then we are opening up again. And that's really, really great and encouraging to see from some of us who have, elderly parents and relatives, know what that impact was like. it's the fact that almost everyone now in these settings has been vaccinated that has allowed that opening up again and those interpersonal meetings, exchanges. And, to go back to the social cultural, it's also about us getting together as a community and feeling the bonds of community that is really lacking. I want there to be a holiday stroll this year. Those kinds of things are really important for us culturally. It's the concerts, it's going to the museums, but those kinds of community gatherings that really define and identify who we are as a community are tremendous. And the loss of those is significant. It's, I think, critical for our overall well-being as communities and individuals that we can experience those again. I'll stop now.
So if I can, Jay, if I can just ask you one quick question before we move on to Tom as a, umbrella of a business owner. I worry from a Chamber of Commerce perspective about everyone who is still working remotely and the impact that has when you don't leave when you don't come to the office every day. I'm not having lunch out. I'm not going into the shops. I'm staying home, I'm making my own lunch. So I do worry about the recovery from that aspect if we continue to have a remotely working, population.
Well, I do too, and I do for, I say that from a couple of perspectives. One, what I mentioned earlier, I think, you lose those unintended exchanges, those unplanned exchanges that I really do think are very important and significant. There's also, a breakdown in the culture of our individual, businesses and work environments when we no longer see each other in the same way. If I am on, which we do, we had all remote staff meetings. We're having a staff meeting, we're getting down to business, but we're really not going to take that time to say, oh, by the way, how's your mother? I'm certainly not going to ask you about how your medical appointment went on a screen full of other employees. It's those kinds of things that you lose. And those are the kinds of things that do bring people together. They create relationships within the work environment that I think are really critically important. They're powerful. They're powerful for the function of an organization because they create the bonds that bind people to the organization. But they're also important for people's social and emotional well-being. I agree completely that I do get concerned at the impacts of isolation. Even just so I walk around a lot, I walk around the city a lot, and you still see people where people might have once smiled and waved at each other. They step aside and part and often avoid eye contact, which I think is really interesting because you're not going to catch COVID from eye contact, but there's this fear of encountering each other. There's fear of the other person that I think is, to me, very, very concerning. And in reality, there's also just only so much time any of us want to stare and probably should, be in front of a screen. So yes, those are, and I will add to that going out to lunch is important for patronizing, our restaurants and our businesses. But those are also those environments where I will see people who I might not have otherwise seen. And those creating those bonds and those relationships are important. The same thing's true for functions. There's a reason why we did business functions, networking functions, conferences. Of course you go for the content, but we all know that, most of us go as much, if not more, for the networking that happened.
Right. And we are bringing our events back live starting in June. So that's a good segue into that. Tom, talk to me about Hampshire Hills experiences before the vaccine and after the vaccine. I am a member of Hampshire Hills, just to lay that out there. So I do know a little bit about what's been going on, but I think it's really interesting, all the different umbrellas. If you can talk to us about the different impacts on the different businesses underneath the Hampshire Hills umbrella, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, Wendy. Thank you. Yeah, as Wendy mentioned, we have a lot of different businesses. I guess if I just follow up on what Jay was talking about, if I had to describe Hampshire Hills in 2 words, I'd say, we're based on social interaction. That's what everything is, and that's what got hit the hardest, right? For those of you not familiar with Hampshire Hills, we have the Hampshire Hills Athletic Club, which is a multi-recreational facility, and the Hampshire Dome, which is next door. Hampshire Hills, in addition to the health club, we have an indoor and outdoor restaurant, Hills and Hills on the Green. We have a cafe. We do functions, wedding, corporate functions, everything along those lines. We have a day spa, which is hair salon, nail salon, massage, those types of things. We got indoor and outdoor pools, indoor and outdoor tennis, 117,000 square feet at Hampshire Hills. And then over the Hampshire Dome, which we rent out primarily sports fields and do events, and that's 94,000 square feet. So, if you're looking at coming out of or going into the pandemic, the things people were most nervous about, we all had. It was gyms, it was hair salons, it was restaurants, it was places where large amounts of people would congregate for expos and events and things at the Hampshire Dome. So, so we took a hit. We actually closed our business about 2 weeks before the governor shut down the state, because we just realized we didn't know enough about what is going on. We couldn't, in good conscience, run not knowing if we could keep people safe. Then we shut down, and we reopened June 1st with the club and July 1st with the Hampshire Dome. During the time we were closed, it was very frustrating. We did do a lot to prepare the club. We kept ourselves busy. Made a lot of changes, but it was very frustrating. But in retrospect, coming out of it, I see what the governor had in mind in terms of making sure that when he did reopen businesses, he didn't have to shut them back down, and we truly appreciate that. So coming out of it, I actually mentioned the governor. He took a tour of our facility in August and told us we were a model of how to deal with COVID. So we were quite proud of that. And, but we feel fortunate that now, almost a year later, we haven't had any known transmissions here. We've had staff and members that have informed us that they've had it, but the transmission has always been elsewhere and no further transmission at the club. But they're kind of broke into 2 or maybe 3 camps of people. One is the people that said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm laying low. And some of them canceled their memberships. Some put their memberships on hold. Our active memberships at the low point we were down about 33% in terms of our memberships. We've now been bouncing back. We're still down about 28%. But for instance, in April, we increased about 4%. People are coming back. So that's one camp. Another camp is the people that just, hey, they really, didn't care. Hardliners on the other side, they're coming in, and the difficulty there was controlling them in terms of, hey, you got to wear a mask when you're moving around the club. You got to do this, so that you can take it off when you're working out. And we had some people that canceled their membership because they didn't want to wear a mask to walk from the front door to the fitness center. Obviously, our function business dried up. We had just spent a considerable sum of money renovating all of our function facilities right before COVID hit. And so that dried up. Nobody was really doing anything. And we've also got the Elliott Hospital. I forgot to mention, also has a physical therapy clinic here at the club. So a lot of different things going on. We have youth summer vacation and day camps, and those took a big hit in terms of restricted numbers last summer. Those are loosening up. But what I'm seeing now, as populations are getting vaccinated, people are coming back, and it's the older groups that are coming back the quickest, which makes sense, right? Because they're the ones getting fully vaccinated first. They're feeling more and more comfortable. They're coming back. We haven't required our staff to be vaccinated. We don't ask. We highly encourage it. We have about 230 employees, but only about 40 are full-time. The rest are part-time and seasonal. And so what we have done is really follow strictly all the guidelines, taking their temperatures every day, checking in, answering the questions. And what I found is people have been really good about, if they get a cold or something, feeling like they have COVID, but staying home. And that's been, I think, great habits to get into, and hopefully those continue. Our restaurant, obviously, when we're able to open the outdoor or the 3-level deck in the back of the club for the outdoor restaurant, we pull people in. So we actually had a great summer last summer in terms of the restaurant, and we've had, although not the last couple of weeks, but prior to this, we had some really warm days and we were able to open it. But overall, people once again, I'm seeing more and more people that would only eat outdoors now feeling comfortable coming indoors, where we have a lot of space to socially distance. We're blessed to have that much space. And I'm seeing other people that weren't here at all coming in, and anecdotal evidence, like every day I see a new face, or just looking at the number of cars in the parking lot. I wrote down somewhere where let's see, our traffic, if I compare our traffic flow from last September, month of September, to what we're seeing now, we're up 36%. So it's all a good sign. I really attribute it to people getting the vaccines, to others feeling more comfortable. Another thing I kind of noticed anecdotally is, while it took a while at the beginning, the younger population, the teenagers, kind of after a few months of the COVID, they kind of, I think, really understood that the reason they needed to be careful was to protect a loved one who was maybe older or compromised. And I think as people get vaccinated, I've noticed the younger people saying, now being like, oh, okay, all my loved ones are vaccinated, I can be and I think maybe you're getting a little more transmission than the younger people. That's just anecdotally what I think I see, but overall I see people a lot calmer about things, and that social interaction starting to happen. We're getting a lot of calls. We're getting new membership tours, a lot of new tours, a lot of calls about our function facilities. The Hampshire Dome, we had a pretty good winter. We did lose some business. We lost an expo. We were going to run a boxing thing that we decided not to run because we didn't want to put that many people in the dome. But interestingly, I picked up a lot of business from Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the restrictions weren't as tight. And in both places, we've managed to run pretty well. So the vaccines, once again, I think has been huge for our business, and perception's reality. And I think the perception is more and more people get vaccinated. I should mention, don't hold this against me, but I'm a Yankee fan. And I was watching their game the other day, and they mentioned the Yankees were the first major league team to get to 85% of vaccination. So that meant that, according to the MLB rules, none of the players or coaches had to wear masks in the dugout, because I guess that's what they said is herd immunity. So it was actually nice to see some faces rather than seeing the coaches behind masks. So I think things are going in a good direction there. So I hope I'm covering some of the things that Wendy and Mike, you were looking for, and certainly if there's something that you'd like me to go into more detail or that I haven't covered, please let me know.
I think that was great insight to, just a snapshot of Hampshire Hill's picture the last, 16, 17 months. I think if anyone has any questions for either Jay or Tom, we'll do that at the end. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Wolf Rosenblum. I had the pleasure of getting to hear her speak to Rotary a few weeks ago, and just very eye-opening, all the science behind this. So it's all yours, Dr. Stephanie.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So let's get this started. I gotta get this. The bar was blocking my. Okay. So thank you so much for the introductions. It is true that I did give a talk to Rotary, both my Rotary West, as well as the Nashville Club. That was almost exactly 1 month ago. And both for the purposes of the people that have heard a similar presentation that I gave, as well as for the people who might hear it on the recording, what I will tell you is the science has changed in the last month. And by the time you hear this recording, if you're not listening to it today, it will have changed again in ways small and large. So always look for the most recent information. And I will tell you that I was updating this presentation as recently as 2 hours ago. So vaccines are important because we have illnesses that have devastated populations, but vaccines are older than you think. And this is a stone from ancient Egypt showing a vaccination. And it also is showing this person appears to have had polio, because you see the leg is deformed. And when the nerves are damaged from polio, then the bones and such do not grow properly. The polio epidemic prior to our polio vaccines, this is something near and dear to Rotarians, in around early 1950s, killed 20,000 people and 3,000 children. And the only thing that we had before the polio vaccine was these plastered on houses. So that was our earliest, perhaps, form of social distancing. But I'd like to talk to you about the normal immune response, because I think it's important to understand it if we wish to understand how the vaccines work. So when a protein, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, a virus or a bacteria encounter a living organism, the organism has an immune response. And that immune response has 2 different pathways. One of the pathways are B cells. The B cells make antibodies. People know antibodies as a protein that coats foreign invaders, makes them more recognizable. They are helped by what's called T cells. This is the other major type of immune cell. And there are helper cells which present this to the B cells so that they make the antibodies, but there are also cytotoxic cells or killer cells that go to destroy the infected cells. What do vaccines do? They train our immune systems to create these antibodies by the B cells, and they prime the T cells just as would happen when we're exposed to a disease. But crucially, they do it so without making us very sick, because the issue is that the immune system is very, very efficient, but very, very slow. So the idea is that the bacteria, a virus, may get the better of an organism, of a human, before the B cells and T cells have time to do their jobs. There are different kinds of vaccines. I talked about proteins. Well, for example, when you get tetanus, the issue is not the bacteria that makes the tetanus, but it's this toxin that they put out that causes the contractions, which can be fatal. There are some proteins that actually aren't so readily recognized by the immune system. So we tag something onto them so they look even more foreign, and the T cells and the B cells can home in on them. And for those persons that have taken the shingles vaccine, if they had chickenpox as a child, susceptible to Shingrix, that's before we had the chickenpox vaccine. So hopefully our children, grandchildren won't get that, is based on that. And then there are whole viruses that are either weakened or inactivated. And that sounds really, really scary. But polio is based on that. And also China's COVID vaccines, the Sinovac and the Sinopharm, are based on that. And that's actually really, really old technology. In the late 1800s, Dr. Jenner realized that milkmaids who had been infected with cowpox, which is a mild relative of smallpox, weren't getting smallpox. And smallpox is devastating. It's disfiguring. That assumes you survive, and it particularly affected young children. So he purposefully infected milkmaids with cowpox, or humans with cowpox, and then tried to get them sick with smallpox, and they didn't. Now, the technology was very crude, and some people got very, very sick. Anybody who's watched Catherine the Great will know about that whole controversy. But there are a more sophisticated technologies that use either virus fragments, or they use a shuttle, if you will, which would be a harmless virus that has a fragment of the virus on it. And the AstraZeneca and the Russian Sputnik, as well as the Johnson & Johnson, also known as the Janssen vaccine, is based on that technology. The newer technology is taking the RNA, the particle that codes for the virus, or a piece of it, and putting it in a little lipid envelope. And Pfizer and Moderna are based on that technology. So what I will tell you is that the importance of COVID vaccines has to do very much with this slide, and it has to do with preventing death. So this is a review of deaths in the United States by age, updated as of 4/28. And you see the distribution, that while it's true that older persons have died more frequently, and this is in a hybrid environment where some were vaccinated and some were not, the older populations tend to be the ones that had the higher mortality, but there are tens of thousands of 50 to 60-year-olds and 40 to 50-year-olds and even younger that have died, because it is 3 times as deadly as the flu. And this is one of the slides that was updated, which basically shows that up to the present time, 3.24 million of deaths worldwide, and 579,000 in the United States. And the information in parenthesis is what it was when I gave the Rotary talk last month. I'm too trigger happy on this, my arrow, sorry. The other thing is preventing serious illness, both acute illness and hospitalization, but also what's called long haul syndrome, which can even develop after an asymptomatic infection. A couple of different sources of information about this. The National Institutes of Health did a survey of 56 countries. 88% of persons that had COVID had suffered memory loss or cognitive dysfunction. An Israeli Public Health Service study, that's a very interesting one, because the entire Israeli population is on the same health record, and they've got 15 or more years of information on everybody that's on the public health service. There is no private. 94% had persistent symptoms at 3 months, and most, but not all, resolved at 6 months. And then there was just a Washington University study that came out within the last 10 days that showed that there is an 8% increase in mortality after people have recovered from the COVID infection, including asymptomatic infections. Long haul symptoms are most commonly fatigue, shortness of breath, cough, joint pain, chest pain, and most notably loss of taste or smell, which is being used in some circles instead of temperatures to determine if people might have a low-level infection. What is really common is brain fog, anxiety, muscle pain, headaches, fevers, palpitations. People are having a lot of racing hearts, even when they're not exercising. And in my practice, I'm seeing a lot of people with new insomnia and other sleep problems. And rare but serious are heart inflammation, abnormal lung function, kidney failure, depression, rash, and hair loss. Also in children, there's something called the multisystem inflammatory syndrome. And there have been over 3,000 children in the United States who have developed devastating illness, which affects all of their body, even after asymptomatic infection, and a small portion of those have died. So in order to understand about the vaccine and understand vaccine safety, you need to know what the virus looks like. And it's called a coronavirus because corona means crown, and it kind of looks like a crown. And it has different things. It has a spike protein, which is how it attaches. It has a membrane envelope, and in that envelope are special membrane proteins. And then inside, what that's carrying is the nucleocapsid, and inside is the piece of RNA. And the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which I said are a fragment, they only have the fragment of this RNA that codes for the spike protein. And that will explain why it is not the entire virus that in those vaccines that is part of the vaccine itself. The importance of COVID-19 vaccines, and this is particularly relevant for people who have had COVID, whether mild or not, is that the vaccines appear to trigger a better immune response than natural infections, which doesn't sound like it should make sense. But the COVID is very sneaky. And what happens is that this is the spike that should attach. But what it does is it kind of enfolds on itself, so the body doesn't see the sharp end of the arrow, if you will. So the vaccines have changed the spike protein ever so slightly, so it can't fold in on itself effectively. The other thing is that another importance of vaccines is this. The RNA is very unstable like DNA, and there's a lot of errors when it replicates itself. The more it replicates itself, the more mutations there are. And this virus is extremely effective at mutating. And the more it gets to replicate in a human, the more mutations occur. And that's one of the things that's really causing a race in time for us to get people vaccinated. Another aspect to think about is that the vaccines are important because there's no good therapies to date. So this is a dashboard from the FDA. This was updated as of 3/31. This was what was on their website this morning. There are 600 drugs in development. There are 440 trials by the FDA. There are 10 treatments authorized for emergency use, and only one treatment, which is the remdesivir, is actually approved for use. And when you look at what we have right in our toolbox right now, there are several widely used, 3 promising, 12 tentative or mixed, 4 not promising, and 3 that fall into the pseudoscience or fraud category. So of all those 600 things that people are looking at, there isn't a ton out there. And again, in the interest of time, I won't read through this, but hopefully you could scan it. It's true that it was an unprecedented timeline because instead of doing things in series, they did them in parallel, but every single one of these underwent preclinical trials, limited safety and dosing trials, expanded safety trials, large efficacy trials, which depended on people getting the vaccine, but then there being a lot of COVID in the environment. One of the things that's come up a lot is that the Pfizer and the Moderna being based on that mRNA technology that's new, people are concerned about it, but actually it's been in developed since the 1990s and was sitting on the shelf being tested for other things when the opportunity to try to use it to make some vaccine was raised. This is a vaccine tracker, and what's important to think about when you're thinking about the vaccines is that of all the candidates, the majority of them are still in trials. There are some that were abandoned, but there are only 8 that are approved for full use in the world. So this comes from a huge pool of people that have been and continue to work on trying to make other vaccines. And emergency use authorization is something that concerns people, understandably, but there are rigorous scientific definitions that anything that is approved for emergency use has to go through all phases of clinical trials. So the idea of vaccine hesitancy is not new. This is a cartoon from the time of Edward Jenner. And people were worried that if you took his cowpox, you would turn into a cow. And it's not something to make light of. When the polio vaccine came out, there initially was a contamination and they stopped it when they had to figure out what that contamination was. So it's understandable that people have concern, but people have concerns when they don't know. And there really isn't time to talk about it today, but if you look up or are interested in understanding about what is real risk and people's perceptions of risk, it's vastly different. And the issue with COVID is that people don't know the science. They don't know a lot of people that may have had it or had the vaccine, or maybe they know 1 or 2 people that have had an experience, and that completely informs their decision making. But when we think about what our risks are, people worry about airplane accidents or a fall or a motor vehicle crash or heart disease, but actually a number of things are much lower risk than we think. And the whole decision about whether to be vaccinated or not is all about what is the relative risk. So the vaccines are considered to be extremely effective. They're very different in their cost. But what it's important to note when you look at the effectiveness of, say, the AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccine relative to the others, the risk of serious illness or hospitalization, that's what the vaccine knocks out. And it's really not even an apples to apples comparison with these, because these were tested when we already had problems such as the South Africa variant and the British variant. We have much more experience now, based on what's been happening in Israel, where they've had mass vaccination. And I can talk about that a little bit if we have time. Vaccine side effects are common, sort of flu-y things, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, and some people, it is said that people must delay their mammograms because some people get swelling in the lymph glands, which is understandable. There are rare, significant side effects. Bell's palsy is when you get paralysis on one side of your face. That's been shown to be temporary. The biggest thing people have been talking about now is the platelets and the strokes. So I want to talk about that for a minute, because the risk of getting low platelet caused bleeding and strokes is 8 to 10 times higher with getting the COVID than getting the vaccine. And there's just a new study that came out again about 2 weeks ago, a multinational study looking at what stroke looks like for people who had COVID. And it's a much younger group. It's a much more male group. And sorry about that. And in about 40% of them, stroke was the first presentation. They were asymptomatic. They didn't know they had COVID. And this is very significant when thinking about the relative risks of vaccine versus getting the disease. Can the vaccines give you COVID? No, it's not a live vaccine. It will not integrate into the DNA anyway. It's mRNA. It doesn't even enter the cell nucleus, and the viral vector vaccines only contain a spike fragments. There's no evidence that it harms fertility, and it does no evidence at this time that it causes autoimmune disease or augmented immunity. And I think what I'm going to do at the moment is stop there, because I know we wanted to have some time for questions, and I want to allow that, and I'll answer questions to the best of my ability.
Stephanie, this isn't a question. I'm going to let Wendy handle the question and answer, but there was one person who asked in the chat if it would be possible to get a copy of this presentation. I'm not sure if you're open to that. Is that something that you would be able to share with anybody who might be interested?
So yes, if they contact me, I would, but again, with the provisor that the science changes constantly. And I want to make sure that the citations are in my notes. They weren't on the slide. So I want to make sure that I, correct that. I also noticed that one of the things that was in the chats had to do with the question about what do we do if we know people are vaccinated and, can we function differently? And what I would say is we certainly hope so. The CDC guidelines allow it, but we also have to take into account that we don't know what the mutations will do. And we don't have complete science about whether a vaccinated person can be a carrier and be a super spreader and not realize it. And we know the vaccines are 95% effective, but then that leaves 5% that are not. So there's still a lot we don't know, and we really need to have take precautions, continue to be cautious about this, especially now that we know that the British variant and our first case of the South African variant have showed up in New Hampshire.
Thank you. So if you could put your email address, that would be preferable to you, in the chat dialogue, Stephanie. And then if somebody is interested in getting a copy of the presentation with that proviso that this is a science in progress, that would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Probably some of the more frequent questions you get in your practice, Dr. Stephanie, you had in the bullet points, but I've been getting some interesting ones as we've been advertising this about the origin of the 1990s vaccine science. Could you debunk some of the myths maybe people are hearing? The DNA one was definitely one of them. Another one was about fetal tissue, aborted fetal tissue, and I don't even know how to respond to that. If that's, well, when they're responsible and they can develop one that didn't come from that kind of question, I don't know where to go with that. So if you could give us some tools for our toolbox of how to respond to that.
So it is true that all of the vaccines at some point in their development, as I said, that the first thing they do is they test things in cells and see what happened.
Right.
And there are old cell lines that are from fetal tissue, stem cells and such, that were used in development of all vaccines. But the mRNA vaccines do not involved in the manufacturing process. They do not involve fetal cells. But some of the others do. I believe the AstraZeneca does. And so I'd be happy to consult with someone. I know that some people have sensitivity about the source of that. Another thing that's come up recently is there's been discussion in the chatosphere about women's menstrual irregularities. And this is something that never came up during any of the trials. And young people were part of the vaccine trials. But now that the criteria for all of us to receive the vaccine is getting into the younger groups and those of childbearing age, a lot of people are discussing that they perceive that they've had menstrual irregularities since receiving the vaccine. And the science is being evaluated, but what we know causes menstrual irregularities is when you change your diet, your environment, your stress level. So there isn't a single person that to the points that have been made earlier that hasn't undergone vast changes in their social environment. And so that is more likely a source of that. But at the current time, there's no evidence that there's a direct link.
That's great information. Thank you. We'll open it up. Does anyone have any questions for any of our three panelists?
Maybe I could just, I noticed in the chat, there was a question directed to me that I think probably needs some clarification.
Okay.
On my part. It says, I'm interested to hear, Tom, about New Hampshire's approach to expecting that either employees or the public is vaccinated. You have different protocols or openness for folks who you know are vaccinated. So the clarification I have to make is we don't ask people if they're vaccinated. What we are looking for is herd immunity. And I'm looking for the medical experts to tell us when our community, our state has reached herd immunity. The information I gave about, well, people coming back, I'm making some assumptions that the older people coming back are vaccinated, or I'm using anecdotal information that they've personally mentioned to me. I say, oh, hey, welcome back. You know, they're like, oh, I got vaccinated. So people have volunteered that information. I'm not expecting it. So we're not treating people differently. And as many of you know, the governor, as of this Friday, the guidelines, I have a folder, I've got about 12 different industry guidelines that we have to follow. Those are being made best practices rather than mandates. And so we are looking at our business. As I mentioned, we've learned a lot as lay people over the last year, and we're not experts, but we've learned a lot. And one thing the governor recognizes that we know our business better than anyone. So the combination of what we've learned and the guidelines, some things we're loosening up a little bit, but a lot of things we're keeping in place. And for instance, all of our staff has to continue to wear masks indoors. The only thing we loosened up the summer is our staff work in the outdoor restaurant because it gets so hot. We'll have the option of having their masks down, and as long as they can maintain 3 feet. Now, we all know 6 feet indoors, but 3 feet distance from people, which they can easily do, taking orders and everything. So that's really the only change we've made for our staff. But we're not treating people differently as they come in. Hey, you're vaccinated. Hey, you're not. We're looking at the population, and based on the population, what the experts tell us, what the science tells us, then we're making business decisions. So I hope that's helpful to clarify that a little bit.
It is, and we actually have 2 last questions for Dr. Stephanie. One, it's actually, they're related to each other. The first one is, what have you found as effective strategies for convincing hesitant people to go ahead and get vaccinated? And the second part is, what is the risk reward calculus for that?
So I think this is a critical question, and I'll build on what Tom said. We will never get to 100% vaccination, even if we do. How long does that immunity last? Will we need boosters? Will the boosters be at 8 months or 12 months or 2 years? And what about the people that took one vaccine, which is maybe 60 or 80%? So we always have to assume there will be some risk. And we make those calculations all the time. Every time you get on the highway, flu is deadly. We have stepped up to points Jay made. Will we go back to where it's okay to go to the office when you're sneezing and coughing and snorting and everybody says, oh well, I'll get a cold. Oh, well, I'll get the flu. I'm strong. I think we're going to have a different calculus about that. But the question Brian asks is critical, and I'm very grateful for it. We have spent a lot of time talking about community responsibility, and that's important. And as when you look at organizations like the United Way and the Chamber and others, my wonderful colleagues in the Public Health Department, the community conversation is critical. We all live and breathe and work together. But when dealing with vaccine hesitancy, which has a lot of different moving parts, the way to convince people is one at a time. And I don't mind about the number of people on this talk. And I have continued to give this talk to organizations that have gotten to 85%, but want to get to 95 or 100%, because what is it to you? And I think that this new data about the strokes is scary as anything. You don't know you have it and you're going to stroke out. And, we didn't have time to focus on that slide, but the number of people that died or had permanent brain damage, I mean, that is just, really something that speaks to people. What about the risks, to our children who can't socialize? That's why I was glad Mike mentioned about my 5 grandchildren that I've watched struggle. I wish I had had him mention about my mother in the nursing home. So everybody has a different story. And I think we need to keep telling stories and find the stories that resonate with individuals. I hope that helps everyone.
Well, thank you very much to our panel today, and to United Way for partnering with us on this. Please, we'll look to update you in the future and stay in touch with all of you. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to express my gratitude to Matt and the Telegraph for helping to be our media partner for this event and to promote it in the community. I will very shortly be sending out to all of our presenters, as well as to the Telegraph and to Wendy, a link to the video, which we'll put up on our YouTube channel, and it will also be saved for posterity on our Facebook page. So thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.